Under the moon's pale light, the ruins breathe. Stones that once bore the weight of emperors now crumble quietly beneath ivy and time. The world believes these empires died, Rome fallen, Byzantium forgotten, Britain dissolved into dust. Yet when the wind moves through the arches and cracks, it carries a strange whisper, not of endings, but of endurance. There is something still alive in the silence, something that remembers. At first glance, the ruins seem asleep, monuments to a history sealed long ago. But look closer, and a subtle pulse remains. The same patterns of power that ruled marble halls now move through glass towers. The same hunger for dominion that filled cathedrals now hums within satellites and trade networks. The empire did not vanish, it only shed its armor, exchanging steel for paper, flags for contracts, thrones for systems too vast to see. Beneath the rhythm of modern life, its old heartbeat continues steady, patient, disguised. Listen long enough, and you begin to hear the echoes. The Roman census became the bureaucrat's database. The imperial road turned into the global supply chain. The British merchant's voyage transformed into a financial algorithm, tracing invisible seas. Even the coins in our pockets, stamped with new faces, carry the same ancient promise: power through belief. Empires never truly die. They dissolve into language, into habit, into the quiet rituals of everyday obedience. In the streets of London, the past hides behind architecture. Columns once carved for kings now frame banks and parliaments. In Istanbul, the domes of Byzantium rise over the call to prayer, blending faiths as seamlessly as centuries. In Rome, beneath the traffic and neon, catacombs still stretch like veins, dark corridors connecting the living to the buried empire that taught them order. We walk upon layers of conquest and forget how deep they go. We call this modernity, as if renaming it sets us free. But perhaps the empire only learned to whisper. Its banners became brands. Its soldiers became citizens trained to obey the invisible. Its palaces became institutions where silence looks like peace. What we mistake for progress might only be evolution, the empire learning new words to describe the same hunger. Every rule of power, every system of hierarchy, carries its ancestry within it. The uniforms may change, but the design never does. Imagine standing at the edge of those ruins as dusk falls. The last light catches on carved marble and rusted gates. For a moment, you might believe history truly sleeps. Yet beneath the soil, in the archives, in the encrypted ledgers of banks, something stirs. The empire's old intelligence still calculates, still watches, still remembers how to endure. It has simply grown quieter, subtler content to guide rather than command. Its control no longer shouts from balconies. It murmurs through screens and laws, through the illusion of choice. The great paradox of civilization is that it never escapes its own reflection. The empires we claim to have outlived still live through us. In our economies, our architecture, our beliefs about power and progress. Even rebellion often serves their pattern, pushing us from one structure into another while the foundation remains untouched. We tell ourselves we are free because the chains are invisible now, forged not from iron, but from trust. If the ruins could speak, they would not mourn their fall. They would smile softly at our certainty, for they know something we have forgotten, that an empire's death is never final, only its disguise renewed. Power is patient. It wears marble and silk, uniforms and logos, and when one mask cracks, it simply reaches for another. The fall of an empire is merely the pause between breaths. And so, the camera lingers on the stones, on the wind brushing through forgotten corridors. The world moves on above, unaware of what sleeps beneath. Yet the silence is not empty. It is waiting. Waiting for those who listen to notice the faint echo behind the hum of modern life, the rhythm that has never ceased. Perhaps the question is not when the empire ended, but when we stopped recognizing its shape. For the old order did not vanish with the crowns and colonies. It learned to hide in plain sight, cloaked in systems we call progress. From the stillness of these ruins, the story drifts toward the unseen architects who ensured this quiet survival, the ones who built the empire to last forever, even without a name. When empires fall, the story is rarely as simple as banners lowered and kings dethroned. The ruins make a convenient illusion a performance of ending. Beneath the ashes, something quieter unfolds. As soldiers return home and historians begin to write their obituaries, the true inheritors of empire gather in silence. They are not generals or monarchs, but merchants, financiers, and administrators who understand that power is not in the crown, but in the ledger. When the empires of marble collapsed, they did not die. They simply passed through a door that only the patient could see. In the fading glow of Rome, it began with families who knew how to count what others could not: debt, loyalty, and time. Senators became bishops, bishops became bankers, and gold became invisible. The temples closed, but the moneylenders' tables never did. In quiet halls, they preserved not the empire's body, but its soul, the systems of hierarchy and tribute that could survive any collapse. The empire no longer needed legions, it only needed networks. One coin, one signature, one promise at a time, it rebuilt itself without ever announcing its return. Through the long centuries, the torch passed from one invisible hand to another. When Rome's roads cracked, Venice's ships took their place. The Republic of Merchants learned that the sea could serve as a new kind of empire, one that ruled not by land but by ledger. They mapped the world not with borders, but with prices. Later, the Dutch refined it further, turning exploration into speculation, and speculation into empire itself. And when the British arose, they learned the final lesson. Control the sea, control the trade, control the story. By the time the sun never set on their dominion, the empire no longer looked like an army, it looked like a company. In this new order, crowns became symbols, not sources of power. Monarchs still smiled from coins, but the true decisions were made in counting houses and councils where sunlight never reached. The East India Company ruled continents under a flag of profit, not of faith. Clerks replaced commanders. Ledgers replaced manifestos. In their calculations, kingdoms became accounts to be balanced, and people became numbers to be moved. What began as conquest became commerce, and what was once called tribute was renamed taxation, investment, and growth. Power learned to hide behind words. Where once there had been empires, there were now nations. Where there had been colonies, there were markets. Where there had been subjects, there were consumers. But the geometry remained unchanged, the same pyramid of influence, with the same unseen summit. History calls it progress, but the structure never altered. It only became more polite, more efficient, more self-assured. Empires no longer raised armies because they had written the rules of every battlefield. When you set the price of everything, you do not need to fight for anything. Consider the transformation of loyalty. In the old world, allegiance was sworn to kings. In the new, it was pledged to institutions. A citizen's faith shifted from monarch to currency, from priest to brand. The bankers of Florence became the bankers of London. The merchants of Venice became the corporations of Wall Street. Their symbols persisted, stylized but familiar. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium finds its reflection in the seals of global finance. The laurel of Rome becomes the wreath of the modern logo. The crown becomes a trademark. Somewhere along the way, the architects of continuity learned that stories could build stronger walls than stone. They told the world that the empire was gone, replaced by democracy and progress. And the world believed them because belief, they discovered, was the cheapest and most durable form of control. If a people believe they are free, they will defend their own chains. If a nation believes it is sovereign, it will guard the very institutions that bind it. The art of empire matured into the science of narrative. Across the centuries, secret councils met not in castles but in conferences and clubs. Their minutes were not written in blood, but in policy and commerce. The language of conquest softened into the dialect of diplomacy. Yet each decision carried the same purpose: to ensure that wealth flowed upward and obedience downward. The empires of faith and crown yielded to empires of data and debt. What once required armies now required algorithms. The sword grew obsolete, replaced by the spreadsheet. Even revolutions, those fiery moments of supposed liberation, often served the same design. Old symbols were toppled, but the machinery of hierarchy remained untouched. The French replaced the Bourbon crown with a republic's bureaucracy. The colonies threw off imperial chains, only to be bound by loans, treaties, and imported ideals. The architects had planned for this. They knew that control does not depend on who rules, but on who defines what ruling means. It is easy to imagine these figures as villains in shadowed rooms, but the truth is subtler and therefore more dangerous. Many of them believed they were preserving civilization, protecting order from chaos. The Roman senator saw himself as the guardian of law. The British financier believed he carried light to distant lands. The modern executive thinks he is building progress. Every empire, even the invisible ones, survives on the conviction that it serves a higher good. That conviction is what makes it unbreakable. And so, history appears to move forward, but always in a circle. The same few continue to write the contracts, shape the currencies, and define the values by which the rest of the world measures itself. The empire has learned the perfection of invisibility. It no longer needs faces, only functions. The men and women who administer it are replaceable. The system they serve is not. It endures precisely because no one sees it as an empire anymore. The streets of Rome are silent now, yet their blueprints live in every parliament, every courthouse, every corporate tower. The old Senate's debates echo in modern legislatures. The imperial treasury finds its voice in central banks. The empire that once conquered with armies now governs with compliance, sustained not by fear, but by faith in systems, in symbols, in the illusion of progress. The ruins, it seems, were never ruins at all. They were foundations. The marble decayed, but the mathematics endured. Power learned to survive by becoming impersonal, transferable, eternal. The architects of continuity did not merely preserve the empire, they perfected it. And as this silent inheritance passed through centuries, it reached the present disguised, normalized, and omnipresent. What began in the Senate and the counting houses now shapes the laws of nations, the flow of markets, the rhythm of daily life. The empire does not march anymore. It circulates. It is in the contracts we sign, the systems we trust, the histories we forget. Empires no longer need armies when they already own the rules. From these hidden architects, the story turns to the minds that designed such endurance, the thinkers, philosophers, and visionaries who transformed survival into ideology. They were the ones who ensured that even when the empires crumbled, the idea of empire would live forever. Every empire begins with force, but the clever ones learn that violence is only the beginning. Swords can win land, but not loyalty. To rule the mind, one must build a gentler prison, one whose walls feel like home. The Romans were among the first to discover this. When their legions subdued foreign soil, they did not rely solely on fear. They offered citizenship, rituals, and belonging. They taught the conquered to see Rome not as their captor, but as their identity. A Roman oath was more than a promise. It was a rebirth. And those who swore it began to defend the very power that had conquered them. Obedience, they realized, thrives when it feels voluntary. The empire's truest triumph was psychological, transforming submission into virtue. It began with the theatre of ritual parades, public vows, coins bearing the emperor's face. Each symbol whispered reassurance that order was natural, eternal, divine. When people saw themselves reflected in those symbols, they mistook the empire's survival for their own. This was the first lesson of control through belonging, to make obedience indistinguishable from identity. Centuries later, that same design was reborn in the classrooms of empire. The British understood that rifles could hold territories, but only lessons could hold generations. They built schools not merely to educate, but to align minds. Children recited pledges, sang hymns to flags, and learned to admire explorers rather than question them. Geography became theology. History became morality. Every map drawn in those rooms was a sermon about order their order. When the bell rang, the children left, believing that obedience was civilization itself. Even the smallest rituals carried invisible power. The uniform was no longer the soldier's armor. It was the student's blazer, the worker's badge, the brand's logo. These were the new insignias of loyalty. The empire had found a way to replicate itself inside the individual through repetition, through rhythm, through pride. To obey no longer felt like surrender, it felt like purpose. The subjects of empire had become its believers. In every age, obedience has worn the colors of virtue. In Rome, it was discipline. In Christendom, faith. In the industrial age, progress. Today, it's professionalism, the quiet pride of conformity disguised as success. Each generation inherits new slogans, but the melody remains unchanged. Follow, repeat, achieve. It is sung in corporate anthems, political campaigns, and even the language of motivation. The empire no longer commands, it inspires. It sells obedience as fulfillment. And yet, beneath the polish, the structure remains the same. The company town replaced the colony, the office replaced the fort, and the meeting replaced the sermon. The architecture of control became psychological, built not of stone but of expectation. The citizen, the worker, the believer all play their parts in a story older than they know. They compete, comply, and consume, mistaking the rhythm for freedom. The empire does not punish disobedience now, it isolates it. Those who resist are not exiled, they are ignored, dismissed, or deemed unproductive. Silence has become the new sword. The brilliance of this invention lies in its subtlety. Ancient emperors relied on spectacle. Modern ones rely on invisibility. The rules of obedience are now internal, enforced by our own reflection. The average citizen wakes not to the call of a ruler, but to the schedule of systems designed long before their birth. They check the clock, the calendar, the notifications, all quiet reminders of belonging. The empire whispers through convenience, shaping the day like a song we never chose but know by heart. In the marketplace, obedience becomes desire. The same psychology that once built armies now builds audiences. Corporate branding perfected what imperial ritual began, the illusion of individuality within conformity. Each purchase, each click, feels like an act of choice, but the choices were designed. The colors, the slogans, the narratives all tuned to the same ancient frequency. Obedience without awareness. We no longer kneel before emperors, we scroll before their descendants. There was a time when obedience was enforced by sword and sermon. Now it is secured by story. The empire learned that to rule the mind, it must offer belonging, meaning, and a hint of destiny. It tells us we are the architects of our own lives, even as it draws the blueprints. It rewards the obedient not with safety, but with recognition, the feeling of being seen, validated, included. In this way, empire has achieved its purest form, self-sustaining obedience. And yet, within this quiet order lies a strange comfort. Humans long for structure, for something larger than themselves. The empire understands this longing better than any prophet or philosopher. It feeds it, nurtures it, turns it into devotion. In the ancient amphitheatre, people cheered for the empire's victories. Today, they celebrate the launch of its newest symbols, brands, nations, movements, all promising progress, while echoing the same old hymns. Still, beneath the surface, the pattern is visible to those who look long enough. The repetition, the slogans, the rituals, all pointing to one truth. Obedience was never about morality or virtue. It was about continuity. It is how the empire lives on, century after century, through new languages, new flags, new gods. When they could no longer rule by fear, they ruled by admiration. When they no longer needed to punish, they taught us to perform. The modern world is full of people proudly serving systems they will never meet, defending structures they will never see, and protecting values they did not create. They do so willingly, even joyfully, because they believe obedience keeps the world from falling apart. Perhaps it does. Perhaps obedience is what binds us, what keeps the fragile illusion of civilization intact. But the empire's genius lies in making us believe there is no other way. It has woven its will into the fabric of what we call normal. To question it feels like heresy. To escape it feels like exile. And so we remain not captives, but caretakers of its invisible throne. They no longer needed to force obedience, they taught us to love it. From this quiet mastery of the mind, the story moves forward, into the empire's most elegant disguise, the language of virtue and progress, where power hides behind beauty and belief. Every empire learns that power alone cannot hold the human heart. Fear fades, force exhausts itself, but beauty endures. The clever rulers understood this long ago. They built not only fortresses, but visions. Their dominion was carved in marble, sung in hymns, painted in frescoes. The architecture of control became breathtaking, so that those who walked beneath it would never think to question it. Power hid itself inside awe. The empire learned that the surest way to keep people obedient was to make them fall in love with their cage. Walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum, and you can still feel it, the harmony of columns, the deliberate geometry of space, the illusion that order itself had been born divine. Those stones were not just decoration, they were persuasion. Each arch and temple whispered a single truth, that beauty and authority were one. When citizens gathered beneath them, they were reminded that their ruler's power was ordained by perfection itself. To resist Rome was to resist the sacred symmetry of the world. The empire had discovered a subtle kind of alchemy, how to turn aesthetics into obedience. Centuries later, that spell evolved. Cathedrals rose where temples had stood, their stained glass glowing like captured stars. The faithful entered those halls not only to pray, but to feel small, humbled by the sheer scale of divine craftsmanship. Yet behind that sanctity lay the same old hierarchy. The rulers on the balcony, the masses on their knees. The beauty of those places was genuine, but it served a purpose. It reminded the people that power was holy, unreachable, eternal. The empire had merely changed its name from Rome to Christendom, but its architecture continued to preach the same gospel. Submission as splendor. In time, universities replaced cathedrals as the temples of modern belief. Their courtyards and libraries carried the same quiet grandeur, the same hierarchy of space. Knowledge, too, became a cathedral, beautiful, structured, reverent. The marble stairs led upward toward truth, but only for those permitted to climb. Students were initiated into the empire's philosophy without ever realizing it. They learned how to speak its language, how to think within its boundaries, how to honor its heroes. Each diploma was a blessing from the same invisible throne. And when they left those halls, they carried with them not rebellion, but refinement, the empire's ideals reborn as intellect. Even the invention of democracy wore the same disguise. The constitutions, the statues, the domes, each designed to echo ancient grandeur. The capitals of the modern world are not accidents of style. They are deliberate echoes of empire. Washington's monuments mirror Rome's. London's skyline hides the same classical bones beneath its glass and steel. Beauty became continuity, a reassurance that the old order had never truly vanished. The architecture of empire persisted because it was never meant to be questioned. It was meant to soothe, to inspire, to silence. Yet the disguise did not end with stone. It seeped into art, music, and education, every language of the senses. The paintings of emperors, the portraits of statesmen, the graceful poses of allegorical figures, all spoke of balance, reason, and grace. But beneath that harmony lay hierarchy. The artist, knowingly or not, became a priest of power, shaping the imagination of generations. Even beauty itself became a commodity, a symbol of status. To own art was to display allegiance. To appreciate it was to internalize the empire's taste. The city of London still carries that legacy. Its old facades speak the language of empire columns, pediments, stone lions guarding glass towers. Inside, the new rulers conduct their rituals of commerce. The echo of the temple is unmistakable. Finance replaced faith, but the aesthetic remained sacred. The architecture tells the same old story in a modern tongue: stability, tradition, inevitability. Power, once sanctified by gods, is now sanctified by design. It would be easy to call all this deception, but that would miss the deeper truth. The beauty is real. The cathedrals are magnificent. The paintings do move the soul. Yet this is precisely what makes them effective. Beauty does not need to lie. It only needs to frame. The empire's genius was not in faking grandeur, but in defining it. By deciding what was beautiful, it decided what was good. And when beauty aligns with authority, rebellion begins to look like ugliness. This pattern repeats wherever civilization rises. The empires of the East adorned obedience with jade and silk. The empires of the West crowned it with marble and gold. Every age paints its power in the colors of its culture, but the principle never changes: to make submission graceful, to ensure that the mind bows before the body does. We admire the symbols because we are meant to. They remind us of stability, of continuity, of a world too elegant to be unjust. And so we continue to build monuments, though we call them different names now: museums, parliaments, skyscrapers. Each one carries the ghost of the same intention. Even our digital world follows the old pattern. The interfaces of power are sleek, minimal, perfect. The empire has learned to build beauty out of pixels instead of marble, to design control so elegantly that we welcome it into our hands. The glow of a cathedral window has become the glow of a screen. The effect is the same: wonder, belonging, and quiet obedience. To see beauty differently is not to reject it, but to understand its dual nature. The same art that uplifts can also hypnotize. The same architecture that inspires awe can also anchor hierarchy. The empire's greatest masterpiece was not a single monument or painting. It was the idea that beauty itself could be trusted. And perhaps that is the most haunting revelation. We are not ruled by ugliness, but by elegance. The empire does not hide behind walls of brutality, but behind the gentle veil of aesthetics. It has taught us to seek comfort in symmetry, to equate refinement with virtue, and to mistake splendor for truth. The most powerful chains, it turns out, are made of gold and marble. As the story moves forward, the lens shifts from image to word, from the empire's architecture to its speech. For after beauty came language, and language would become its most invisible weapon of all. Long before machines or missiles, before the empire learned to rule through commerce or code, it conquered through language. Words were its first soldiers, small, obedient, and invisible. With them, emperors rewrote reality. A sword can kill a man, but a word can make millions kneel. The true conquest of history was not waged with armies, but with definitions. Every civilization that rose to power began by naming the world, and in doing so, claimed it. The Romans understood this better than anyone. They gave their empire a name that meant something more than territory civitas, civilization itself. To be Roman was not merely to obey Rome, it was to be civilized. Everyone else, by contrast, was barbarous, those whose speech sounded like meaningless noise. With that one word, Rome drew a border that outlasted its legions. It taught the world that language was not a tool for communication but for classification. To speak the empire's tongue was to belong. To speak otherwise was to exist outside reason, outside history. Even after Rome's fall, its words refused to die. Latin became the bloodstream of power, the language of law, science, and salvation. Priests and scholars guarded it like a relic, ensuring that only the initiated could understand the sacred texts of both God and empire. Knowledge became a fortress built of grammar. To enter, one had to speak correctly, write elegantly, think in the sanctioned tongue. And so, the empire endured not through armies, but through syntax. Centuries later, English inherited the crown of words. The British Empire discovered that ships and soldiers could spread its influence, but language could sanctify it. Words like progress, enlightenment, and development became moral weapons. Colonization was framed not as conquest, but as education. To civilize became synonymous with to rule. The empire's victims were told they were being lifted, taught, improved. The word itself erased the violence beneath it, and the more those words were repeated, the more the world forgot who had written them. Language, once created to describe truth, became a means of disguising it. Every system of control found safety in euphemism. Pacification meant invasion. Stability meant subjugation. Peacekeeping meant occupation. The pattern continued, century after century, through republics and revolutions alike. When one empire fell, its vocabulary was quietly adopted by the next. Words became inheritance, the hidden continuity of power disguised as progress. Modern propaganda did not invent this technique. It only perfected it. The slogans of nations, corporations, and movements all trace their ancestry to Rome's inscriptions. Freedom, unity, security. Words repeated until they cease to mean anything at all. They become lullabies, sung not to awaken thought but to cradle it. Each repetition polishes away complexity until only obedience remains. The empire discovered that if you define virtue, you can commit any sin in its name. Even the language of rebellion often carries the empire's echo. The word revolution once meant to turn again, a cycle, not a rupture. The empire kept its grip by shaping even the vocabulary of defiance. It allowed people to fight, as long as they did so in words it had already blessed. In this way, control became invisible, woven into the very sentences used to question it. The world speaks the language of empire, even when it believes it is free from it. Consider how every modern institution relies on this linguistic inheritance. Governments issue statements, corporations shape narratives, algorithms feed us content. None of these are new ideas, only new disguises for the same principle. Whoever frames the story owns the truth. Words build the walls of the world, and few ever notice they are inside. The empire's greatest achievement was to make language seem neutral. We believe words merely describe reality, when in truth they create it. Every label, every slogan, every name carves the world into shapes of authority and submission. Civilized versus savage, developed versus undeveloped, democracy versus disorder. These binaries define not just politics, but perception. They tell us what to admire and what to fear. And because they sound moral, we rarely see their edges. Even our idea of knowledge bears this mark. The language of science, of reason, of fact, all emerge from the same soil that nurtured empire. To name something is to own it. To categorize it is to claim mastery. The botanist's Latin names for plants, the geographer's titles for territories, the economist's terms for value, all follow the same instinct: to fix meaning so firmly that no one remembers it was ever fluid. Yet beneath that stability lies a quiet violence, the erasure of other voices, other ways of knowing. The empire of words continues today, though its capitals are no longer cities but screens. The modern citizen swims through oceans of language crafted to persuade, distract, and define. News feeds, advertisements, political speeches, they all echo the same ancient principle. Control the word, and you control the world it describes. What was once carved in stone is now typed in pixels, but the effect is the same. We are surrounded by sentences that shape our sense of what is normal, possible, or true. And still, beauty lingers in it. Language remains humanity's most extraordinary invention, its poetry, its tenderness, its capacity for wonder. That is why it works so well as a disguise. The empire cloaked itself in eloquence, knowing that people trust what sounds beautiful. Words soothe the mind while binding it. They make obedience feel intelligent, agreement feel virtuous. The empire no longer needs to dictate, it only needs to define. So much of what we believe to be freedom may only be fluency, the ability to speak the empire's tongue without hearing its accent. We carry its vocabulary in our mouths like inherited relics, unaware that we are repeating the same ancient scripts of hierarchy and faith. To break free, one must first listen not to what words say, but to what they silence. The empire's greatest invention was not the sword, it was the sentence. It conquered the imagination first, and the rest followed. Every law, every prayer, every advertisement is part of its endless grammar. And as long as those words remain unexamined, the empire continues to write through us. If language shaped minds, what might faith have done to souls? That is where the story now turns to the sanctuaries and sermons where power learned to speak as God. The empire's greatest secret was not hidden in vaults or archives, but in altars. From the beginning, it understood that belief could do what fear never could, make people love their chains. The first emperors discovered that power cloaked in divinity could silence rebellion more effectively than any sword. To rule by decree was fragile, to rule by faith was eternal. They crowned themselves with the aura of gods, built temples in their own names, and taught the people that obedience was not just duty, it was salvation. When Caesar was deified, it was not merely vanity, it was strategy. To question him became blasphemy. The empire learned that the sacred could sanctify the political, that prayer could serve policy. Religion gave the crown its halo and the treasury its justification. Every offering, every ritual, was a transaction not between man and heaven, but between citizen and state. The priests and rulers became two halves of the same coin, one promising grace, the other demanding tribute. The faithful gave gold for forgiveness and loyalty for hope, and the empire grew rich on both. Even when Rome fell, its theology of power survived. The church inherited the empire's architecture, its ceremonies, its appetite for obedience. The vestments changed, but the system did not. Bishops replaced governors. The pope replaced the emperor. The incense replaced the laurel. From the pulpits, the old message continued in a softer voice, that to serve the institution was to serve the divine. The cross, once a symbol of suffering, became a banner under which armies marched. Salvation became territory. Faith became empire's most exquisite disguise. Throughout the Middle Ages, the partnership between crown and altar defined the world. Kings ruled by the grace of God, and rebellion became heresy. Cathedrals rose like mountains of faith, but beneath their foundations flowed gold, the quiet tribute of labourers, peasants, and pilgrims. The church promised heaven while building its own on earth. Estates, libraries, treasuries of relics and indulgences. The faithful poured their wages into the offering plate, believing they were purchasing eternity. Few noticed that eternity had an address. And yet, within this system, belief was not always false. Many who preached truly believed. The monks who copied scriptures by candlelight, the missionaries who crossed oceans, the saints who died in chains, they were sincere. The tragedy was not their faith, but how it was used. The empire understood that sincerity was the perfect vessel for control. When truth is wrapped in devotion, it no longer needs to be proven. It only needs to be proclaimed. By the Renaissance, the balance between God and gold tilted once more. The papal court in Rome glittered with wealth, drawn from indulgences, salvation sold like merchandise. This was not merely corruption. It was the logical evolution of empire. The idea of buying forgiveness was not born of greed alone, but of continuity. The treasury of heaven had merged with the treasury of earth. The Reformation that followed did not destroy that bond, it merely redistributed it. Kings replaced popes as spiritual bankers. Faith moved from cathedrals to constitutions, from altars to ideals, but it continued to sanctify authority. When the age of discovery began, the gospel and the flag sailed together. Missionaries walked beside soldiers, carrying crosses into jungles and deserts. They called it salvation. History remembers it as conquest. Yet the paradox remains: they believed they were saving souls, even as they extinguished cultures. In their journals, one can still feel the purity of their intent. They did not see themselves as agents of empire, but as servants of light. That was the genius of the system. It convinced its instruments that they were instruments of good. On the shores of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, the empire baptized conquest in the language of virtue. It built churches beside forts, schools beside plantations, and called them blessings. Converts learned new prayers and new debts. Each conversion expanded not only the faith, but the market. The word mission came to mean both spiritual duty and economic enterprise. Souls and resources were counted in the same ledgers. As centuries passed, the alliance between God, crown, and coin deepened into something more abstract. Faith became a structure of value, not only moral, but monetary. The promise of heaven found its reflection in the promise of credit. Both demanded belief in the unseen. Both rewarded patience and obedience. The banker's word trust once belonged to the priest. Now it belonged to the market. The empire had replaced divine judgment with financial morality. Sin became debt, and redemption became repayment. In modern times, the pulpit has changed again. The sermons come through screens, the hymns are jingles, the temples are banks and corporate towers reaching skyward like steeples. The faithful gather not for prayer, but for profit, repeating the new liturgy of growth, innovation, and prosperity. The old virtues remain discipline, sacrifice, faith in a greater plan, but their language has shifted. Heaven has been relocated from eternity to the future. Salvation now arrives through investment. Still, the symbols persist. Our coins and currencies bear the same ancient echoes. Crowns, crosses, mottos invoking trust in powers unseen. The empire continues to preach, though its scripture is economic and its miracles statistical. Nations rise and fall, but the creed remains that order is holy, that hierarchy is natural, that wealth is proof of grace. It is the same theology dressed in modern light. The rich are blessed, the obedient rewarded, the doubtful cast out as unprofitable. And yet, beneath this intricate machinery, belief remains deeply human. The need to belong, to find meaning, to trust in something beyond chaos, that longing has always been sincere. The empire merely built its foundation upon it. It learned to channel faith like a river, using it to power both morality and economy. In this way, it created a perfect cycle. Belief feeding wealth, wealth validating belief. The altar and the ledger became one system, each sustaining the other. They preached heaven but built kingdoms here on earth. The phrase could describe any age, any empire, any faith that mistook its reflection for its God. It is not condemnation, but observation, a recognition that purity and power have always been uneasy companions. As the centuries turn, the alliance endures. We may no longer kneel before emperors or priests, but we still measure worth through symbols they designed. Our prayers are financial, our hopes are contractual, our fears are indexed. The empire's most enduring miracle was not its monuments or armies, but its ability to merge salvation with survival. And so, faith and finance continue their quiet dance. Two strands of the same design, twining through history like a double helix. Each promises redemption, each demands belief. Together, they form the DNA of civilization itself. From this union of God, crown, and coin, the story now widens. The next chapter follows how these forces, bound together, spread across oceans and centuries, transforming from kingdoms into networks, from crusades into commerce, from prayer into profit. Before ships conquered oceans, maps conquered the imagination. A single sheet of parchment could claim the world before a single sail was raised. The empire understood this early, that to draw a line was to decide who existed within it. Every map, no matter how delicate its ink or gilded its frame, was a declaration of control. The explorers may have carried compasses and courage, but behind them stood cartographers with colder ambitions. They didn't just record what they found, they invented it. In the candlelit chambers of Lisbon and Venice, men bent over tables, tracing coastlines they had never seen. The Portuguese called it discovery, but their pens moved with hunger, not wonder. Each new curve of coastline promised spice, gold, labor the currency of dominion. The cartographers' quills moved faster than the ships themselves, sketching continents into commodities. The ocean became a page, the world a ledger. And with every new drawing, the empire's appetite grew. Those early maps were never neutral. The size of a nation, the color of its borders, the placement of its name, all spoke of value and hierarchy. The center of the world was wherever the empire happened to be. Europe swelled on the parchment, Africa shrank. The unknown lands were left blank, labeled only with monsters or Latin warnings terra incognita. It was not ignorance, but opportunity. Emptiness invited ownership. The empire would fill the void with itself. As the age of navigation bloomed, exploration became theatre. Behind the language of adventure lay bureaucracy charters, licenses, and royal decrees written in the same ink as the maps. The sailors who reached the Indies or the Americas were not merely wanderers, they were instruments of measurement. Each discovery was followed by a boundary, each boundary by a claim. And when the compass needles steadied, the empire redrew the world to fit its reflection. They didn't discover new lands, they renamed ancient ones. Consider the East India Company, a merchant fleet on the surface, but beneath it, a moving empire of maps. Every new trading post required charts, surveys, and inventories. Rivers were renamed, roads numbered, villages catalogued. What was once sacred geography became administrative geometry. To map a people was to possess them. The empire turned territory into data, and data into power. Its dominion spread not by conquest, but by cartography. And yet, the tone of the age was reverent. The explorers spoke of beauty, of wonder, of divine purpose. Their journals glowed with awe at the stars, the forests, the vastness of creation. But beneath the poetry lay the arithmetic of empire. Every horizon was measured, every miracle weighed. Discovery became a system, a machine that translated wonder into wealth. Maps, once symbols of curiosity, became blueprints of extraction. The artistry of those maps still deceives us. They are beautiful oceans painted like silk, coastlines edged with gold, compass roses blooming like flowers. But beauty, as always, served the empire well. A map's elegance made its authority unquestionable. To frame the world so perfectly was to imply ownership. The map was never meant to be read by the conquered, only by the conqueror. For the people who lived within its lines, their own world was erased and redrawn, their rivers, renamed, their borders shifted, their existence measured in miles and degrees. Over time, the map replaced the land itself. Decisions were made, not in fields or forests, but in drawing rooms thousands of miles away. The ink decided what the sword would later confirm. Even rebellion had to begin with geography fighting to reclaim what a stranger's hand had defined. And when the empire finally retreated, its lines remained. Borders drawn centuries ago still divide nations, still spark wars, still dictate who belongs and who does not. The ink never truly dried. The empire's genius was to turn exploration into virtue. Its navigators were hailed as heroes, its merchants as pioneers, its maps as miracles of progress. The language of conquest was softened by romance. We still tell those stories today, of brave captains and endless seas, forgetting that every voyage carried a ruler's shadow. For every star charted, a culture was silenced. For every coastline drawn, a world was renamed. The empire's maps were acts of imagination, and imagination, when possessed by power, can become a weapon. Even now, maps remain instruments of belief. The colors have changed, the borders rearranged, but the purpose endures: to simplify, to claim, to convince. Digital satellites now orbit the globe, mapping it again with microscopic precision. Every inch of Earth is measured, categorized, monetized. The empire no longer needs explorers, it has algorithms. The maps have become alive, updating themselves, learning our movements, predicting our desires. We are all charted now, every step recorded, every route optimized. The world has never been smaller or more mapped, and yet the illusion remains the same, that the one who holds the map holds the truth. They didn't discover the world, they redrew it. The line between exploration and control has always been an illusion, a story we tell to make domination sound noble. But if we listen closely, we can still hear the parchment crackle beneath the weight of ambition. A sound older than empires, echoing in every digital coordinate, every boundary line, every word that says mine. The camera lingers on those old maps, the faded ink, the mythical beasts swimming in empty seas, the compass roses pointing toward power. The narrator's voice softens, almost a whisper, as the truth settles. Every map is a desire made visible, every desire a shadow cast by power. From these cartographic dreams, the story drifts onward to the veins that carried those dreams across the globe. From maps to markets, from ink to gold, the empire's reach would soon flow not through oceans, but through trade itself. If maps drew the empire's outline, trade filled its veins. Beneath every conquest and flag, there pulsed a quieter rhythm, the steady exchange of goods, wealth, and obedience. The empire learned early that war could seize a nation, but trade could keep it. Gold traveled further than armies, spice and silk outlasted soldiers, ships replaced swords, contracts replaced crowns. Power, once visible, now moved beneath the surface, disguised as commerce. In the beginning, merchants were wanderers, traders, following the scent of cinnamon, the shimmer of silk, the rumors of gold. But soon, their journeys became the empire's arteries. The spice routes were not only paths across oceans, they were corridors of control. Every port became a gate, every tariff a quiet tribute. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, they all learned that trade was the most efficient form of conquest. It didn't need to destroy, it only needed to connect. The empire realized it could own the world not by ruling it, but by pricing it. The East India Company perfected this design. What began as a group of merchants became a kingdom without a king, its soldiers hired, its fleets chartered, its wars fought for balance sheets. The company governed millions, minted its own coins, and negotiated treaties with monarchs as its equals. The sun never set on its profits. When rebellions broke out, the company did not send armies of citizens, but armies of shareholders. Its conquests were signed, not declared. It was the purest expression of the new order, an empire not of nations but of accounts. Trade was the empire's great illusion of equality. Every exchange seemed mutual, every deal voluntary. Yet beneath each bargain lay imbalance, the unspoken arithmetic of dependency. Colonies sent sugar, cotton, and labor. The empire sent back debt, bureaucracy, and faith in the system that bound them. For the first time in history, slavery did not always need chains. The ledger became the new shackle, ink replacing iron. A man who owed could be ruled as easily as one who feared. As centuries turned, the trading empires evolved. The merchants' guilds of the Middle Ages transformed into banks. The fleets became financial networks. The same families who once traded salt and silver now traded credit and information. The products changed, but the structure endured monopoly hidden beneath cooperation, control disguised as competition. The old chartered companies may have vanished, but their ghosts live in every modern corporation. Their logos are coats of arms, their boardrooms are courts, their shareholders the new aristocracy. The Industrial Revolution did not destroy the empire, it mechanized it. Factories became colonies of their own, powered by workers who rarely saw the wealth they created. The trade routes expanded inland, stretching through railroads, telegraphs, and later, cables of data. The empire no longer needed to occupy land, it only needed to occupy systems. It owned the ports, the banks, the prices, the laws. It had become something more resilient than a nation, a living economy, without borders, without morality, without rest. In this new age, the merchant replaced the monarch. Where kings once demanded loyalty, markets demanded trust. Where soldiers once enforced law, contracts enforced consent. The people were told they were free because they could buy and sell, never realizing that the choices themselves had been arranged. The empire had learned to rule invisibly, not by decrees, but by design. Freedom became another form of obedience, one transaction at a time. The 19th century saw the birth of global finance, the invisible empire that would outlast all others. Central banks, stock exchanges, and insurance houses emerged as temples of modern faith. Their architecture echoed cathedrals, their language echoed theology, credit, trust, redemption, security. The same belief that once bound men to gods now bound them to capital. People no longer prayed for rain, they prayed for stability, for growth, for interest rates to stay merciful. The empire had replaced divine providence with economic prophecy. And like all faiths, it required rituals. The ticking of clocks on trading floors replaced the chanting of monks. The markets opened and closed like sacred ceremonies. Their fluctuations read like omens. The priests of this faith wore suits instead of robes, but their creed remained ancient. Obedience to the invisible hand, the unseen order that promised abundance if only one believed enough. The empire's theology had become mathematical. By the 20th century, empires no longer needed colonies, they had corporations. A company could do what a kingdom never could: transcend borders, survive revolutions, outlive nations. The new conquerors didn't build fortresses, they built brands. Their armies were advertisements, their treaties were mergers, their subjects were consumers. And the world, exhausted by centuries of war, welcomed them. It mistook their efficiency for peace, their profit for progress. Today, the same currents flow faster and deeper. Digital trade has replaced the caravans and caravels. Data has become the new spice, harvested and sold by unseen merchants. Every click, every search, every heartbeat measured by devices is part of the new exchange. We no longer trade goods, we trade ourselves. The empire has completed its metamorphosis. It no longer conquers, it consumes. The empire learned to rule without kings by owning everything instead. Ownership itself became invisible, a web of holding companies, trusts, and shell corporations so intricate that power cannot be traced, only felt. Governments rise and fall, but the system remains, adjusting quietly, like a tide. Nations borrow from the same banks, obey the same markets, chase the same illusion of endless growth. The empire no longer flies a flag because it no longer needs to. Its anthem is the hum of transaction. And yet, within this vast machinery, the human pulse remains. The merchant's hunger for exchange, the sailor's curiosity for the unknown, the craftsman's pride in his work, these old instincts still beat beneath the empire's metallic skin. Trade began as connection, as trust between strangers, and perhaps that spark still survives. But over it hangs a shadow, the long echo of centuries when exchange became extraction, when the ledger ruled the heart. Now the empire breathes through numbers. It speaks in currencies and contracts, in balance sheets and algorithms. Its face is no longer the king, but the price. Its capital is not a city, but a network that stretches endlessly, touching every life, every dream. We live inside it, often without realizing it, working, spending, and believing as if it were the only world that could exist. From this hidden empire of trade, the story turns inward toward the human mind itself. For after centuries of mapping, conquering, and exchanging, the empire's greatest experiment began, reshaping the very thoughts of those who serve it. Freedom is the empire's most beautiful invention. It is the perfume that masks the scent of control, the lullaby that soothes restless minds. Through centuries of trial and error, the empire perfected its finest illusion that obedience can coexist with liberty. It learned that people will defend their own subjugation if they believe they chose it. Once, power was visible: crowns, chains, armies. Now it hides behind the mirror, smiling back as the reflection of our own desires. In the old kingdoms, submission was simple. A subject knew his place, a ruler wore his crown. The priest spoke of divine order, and the farmer accepted it as fate. But modernity demanded subtlety. The age of rebellion had taught the empire that overt power breeds defiance, so it changed its strategy. It stopped commanding and began suggesting. It replaced the whip with the ballot, the sermon with the slogan, the decree with the advertisement. The result was not chaos, but harmony. A society that felt liberated precisely because it could not see its leash. The illusion of choice began with politics. Democracy promised voice, agency, participation. Yet beneath its noble words, the architecture remained familiar. The people voted, but only among options already sanctioned. The rhetoric of freedom disguised the machinery of continuity. The empire realized it could preserve control not by silencing dissent, but by amplifying it, dividing citizens into camps that would endlessly argue while the system stayed intact. Debate became ritual. Outrage became entertainment. The empire had discovered how to turn opposition into oxygen. Commerce followed the same design. The market promised abundance, individuality, self-expression through consumption. We were told that every purchase was a decision of the soul, a vote cast for identity. But what is choice when every product, every brand, every desire has been crafted by the same invisible architects? The empire no longer tells its subjects what to buy, it teaches them what to want. It fills their dreams with symbols of freedom: a faster car, a sleeker screen, a private escape that leads nowhere new. The cages grew luxurious, the walls transparent, and the prisoners smiled as they decorated them. Entertainment became the final veil. Once, religion occupied the mind. Now, distraction does. The empire learned that control need not repress thought if it can drown it in noise. Infinite choices in film, news, and media create the illusion of diversity, but their purpose is singular: to occupy attention. A mind that is always stimulated never stops to question. The old empires ruled through scarcity. The new one rules through saturation. It offers endless novelty while quietly stealing silence. This is the genius of invisible governance. Every citizen believes himself autonomous, even as his emotions, fears, and ambitions are engineered. Algorithms predict behavior with divine accuracy, feeding individuals the words, images, and validations they crave most. The empire no longer issues commands, it whispers preferences. Its rule is not over bodies, but over patterns. And because the subjects experience pleasure, they defend it as freedom. To rebel would feel like deprivation. The illusion deepens through language. Freedom is now measured in purchases, opinions, and access. We are told we can be anything, yet everything we become fits neatly within predefined frameworks. Careers, ideologies, lifestyles, each feels self-chosen but leads to the same destination: dependence. The citizen works to afford the symbols of liberty, unaware that he is financing his own captivity. The empire's brilliance lies in its mimicry of autonomy. It allows its subjects to choose between identical cages painted in different colors. Even our dissent is commodified. Counterculture becomes culture. Rebellion becomes style. The empire anticipates every objection, packages it, and sells it back as individuality. The protester wears the empire's fabric, speaks its language, posts on its platforms. Every cry of defiance echoes within systems built to amplify it, monetize it, and neutralize it. The appearance of opposition sustains the illusion that freedom still exists. In this way, the empire perpetuates itself through the very energy meant to destroy it. Yet, the control is not purely sinister. It is tender, almost parental. the empire offers safety in exchange for surrender. It protects its citizens from hunger, disease, and loneliness, but at a cost: dependence. In this comfort, the human spirit forgets its wildness. Convenience becomes the new religion. We no longer pray for salvation. We subscribe to it. The empire learned that the easiest way to govern humanity is to fulfill its desires faster than it can question them. And so, people wake each morning believing they are free. They choose their breakfast, their outfit, their newsfeed, unaware that each choice was anticipated, priced, and presented by unseen algorithms. They speak of rights and freedoms, yet spend their hours working for systems that decide their worth. The empire no longer enforces conformity. It simulates choice until conformity becomes natural. The subjects no longer resist, because resistance feels unnecessary. They have everything they were told to want. There is no tyranny in this order, only rhythm, a quiet synchronization of billions acting in harmony, each convinced he is the composer of his own song. This is the perfection of the design: control without coercion, obedience without awareness. The empire has become invisible because it has moved inside the mind. It no longer rules, it curates. It no longer punishes, it distracts. The empire's perfection lies in making its subjects believe they aren't. And when? Occasionally, a flicker of realization breaks through a late-night unease, a question about whether choice is real. The empire soothes it with novelty. It releases a new product, a new debate, a new distraction. The moment of awakening fades beneath the soft weight of routine. The machine hums on. But still, a few awaken fully. They begin to notice how every path loops back to the same center. They see that even choice can be captivity, if the framework is unchangeable. And with that realization, the illusion trembles. For once, awareness enters, the spell begins to break. The empire's mastery depends on forgetting, on keeping its subjects dreaming with open eyes. From this quiet hypnosis of freedom, the story turns toward the next revelation: how the empire maintains its illusion not only through choice, but through memory itself, rewriting the past so the present can never be questioned. Every empire knows that memory is dangerous. Stones can crumble, armies can fall, but stories, if left unguarded, can awaken the dead. So the empire learned to rule not only through laws and trade, but through forgetting. It discovered that silence could do what violence never could: erase a truth so completely that even the descendants of those who lived it would doubt it ever happened. History, as we know it, is not the past, it is the empire's most polished invention. They call it education, but it begins with omission. The story is simplified, then shortened, then replaced. Empires write history, the way cartographers draw maps, shrinking some lands, expanding others, removing what does not serve the design. Each generation inherits a slightly different version, until what began as conquest becomes civilization, and what began as rebellion becomes chaos. The empire does not destroy memory outright. It rewrites it into something beautiful enough to believe. Walk through any museum, and you can see the art of forgetting displayed behind glass. Artifacts stolen from other worlds are arranged as trophies of discovery. The plaques speak in the language of benevolence: acquired, preserved, brought to light. Not a word about what was buried. The relics of forgotten kingdoms are labeled with the names of those who conquered them. History, neatly curated, becomes a mirror that shows only one face: the empire's own reflection. Even ruins participate in this quiet deceit. The empire leaves them standing, half broken, as proof of its victory. Tourists photograph them, unaware that the fallen stones once held stories the victors refused to translate. Every monument that survives does so by permission. Every blank wall hides a vanished tongue. The empire's silence is selective. It forgets only what threatens its continuity. Some cultures vanish without conquest at all. Their disappearance is bureaucratic, gradual, polite. Languages die when schools stop teaching them. Traditions fade when funding ceases. Archives are sealed for preservation, and the past is locked away like a dangerous relic. One day, the people wake to find their grandparents' words extinct, their songs untranslatable, their heroes unnamed. And so, the empire succeeds, not by burning memory, but by suffocating it slowly, until even nostalgia forgets what it mourns. Wars are remembered the same way. The victors compose the narrative, drafting guilt and glory into convenient symmetry. A century later, the massacres are renamed campaigns, the atrocities, mistakes, the resistance, uprisings. The empire's textbooks hum with dignity. Children learn about triumphs, not tragedies. The blood is edited out. The silence between the lines grows thicker than the words themselves. By the time the truth is rediscovered, it feels like conspiracy. Heroes, too, are remade. The inconvenient ones, the dreamers, the rebels, the questioners, are recast as madmen or zealots. Their names survive, but their meaning does not. Their statues stand in plazas, but their messages are forgotten. The empire is generous in this way. It allows the image to remain, provided the substance is erased. Even defiance becomes decoration. It is how power disarms memory, by framing rebellion as heritage. But forgetting is not always imposed. Sometimes it is chosen. The people, weary of grief, participate in their own amnesia. They prefer comfort to clarity. They repeat the empire's stories because they are easier to live with than the truth. The mind learns to filter pain, the way eyes adjust to darkness. Forgetting becomes survival. And so, the empire's greatest ally is not fear, but fatigue. The art of forgetting thrives in noise. Every day brings a new flood of information, too much to absorb, too little to understand. The present becomes so overwhelming that the past fades into abstraction. The empire's distractions, its endless updates and headlines, serve a single purpose: to keep memory disoriented. In this constant motion, no injustice lasts long enough to mature into history. Outrage turns to apathy, apathy to silence. The empire erases without erasing, it simply moves faster than memory can follow. There are still traces, though. A fragment of an old song, a myth told by elders, a ruin misaligned with official maps. These small survivors whisper from the edges, asking to be remembered. They remind us that forgetting is never complete. It only waits for rediscovery. The empire can suppress the past, but it cannot destroy the instinct to remember. Somewhere, always, someone is keeping the record alive. A scribe in exile, a mother's lullaby, a story told in defiance of the script. And yet, for most, the silence remains soothing. Forgetting gives the illusion of peace. It allows the world to move on, to believe in progress. The empire thrives on this illusion that memory is a burden best laid down. It builds monuments to remembrance, while ensuring that what is remembered poses no threat. Never again, it says, even as the pattern repeats. Forgetting, it turns out, is not absence, it is design. They erase the past, so we'll never notice the present. The line is not accusation, but revelation. The empire's mastery lies in replacing truth with narrative, fact with sentiment, tragedy with entertainment. It does not fear exposure, it fears context. It knows that if people ever remembered fully, they would recognize the same old structures wearing new names. The art of forgetting is the empire's final fortress, the wall that keeps awareness from reaching rebellion. But walls, no matter how high, are never perfect. Cracks appear. A document resurfaces. A language is revived. A hidden history finds its voice. In those moments, the past breathes again, and the illusion trembles. From these forgotten depths, the story now turns to those who refused to forget the quiet rebels who carried forbidden truths across generations, keeping the fire alive in the shadows of empire. Beneath the empire's polished surface, where monuments gleamed and order reigned, another world quietly breathed. It did not march or shout or raise banners. It whispered. It hummed through poems, songs, and stories told behind closed doors. Its soldiers were not warriors but dreamers, scribes, singers, painters, and wanderers who refused to let truth vanish. The empire, proud of its silence, never noticed the murmur beneath its feet. Yet that murmur, gentle and patient, was the heartbeat of rebellion. Every age breeds its hidden rebels. When laws forbade speech, they learned to write in symbols. When the empire burned their books, they memorized them. When temples fell, they turned their prayers into songs no authority could decode. In taverns, monasteries, and humble kitchens, they gathered not to conspire in violence, but to preserve what power sought to erase. Their defiance was not destruction, but remembrance. They fought the empire not with swords, but with stories. In the shadow of Rome, early philosophers disguised their heresies as fables. Aesop's animals spoke truths too dangerous for human tongues. Later, in medieval courts, troubadours composed love songs that carried messages of freedom between their rhymes. The Inquisition banned heretical books, but couldn't stop the poems that lived inside people's hearts. Across centuries, stories became vessels carrying forbidden ideas through the cracks of empire, like seeds on the wind. Even art became insurgent. In the glow of candlelight, painters hid resistance in plain sight, symbols tucked into tapestries, faces of saints painted to resemble the condemned. A gesture, a colour, a misplaced star, all became quiet acts of defiance. The illiterate learned to read rebellion not in words, but in images. To the untrained eye, these works were devotional. To those who knew, they were maps of survival. The empire's galleries displayed its glory, never realizing they also preserved the fingerprints of dissent. Folk tales carried the same power. In villages too small for armies, peasants spoke of trickster gods who outwitted kings, of wise fools who exposed tyranny with laughter. These tales soothed the oppressed, teaching that cleverness could defeat cruelty. Each retelling disguised hope as entertainment. The empire tolerated them as superstition, not realizing they were blueprints for endurance. Myths outlasted decrees. Long after laws were forgotten, the stories remained adaptable, immortal, waiting for a new generation to understand their true meaning. Scholars, too, became rebels of memory. In hidden rooms, they copied forbidden manuscripts by hand, passing them down through centuries. In Alexandria's ashes and the monasteries of Ireland, fragments of lost civilizations found sanctuary. These scribes knew they could not defeat empire, but they could outlast it. Knowledge, preserved through patience, would one day outlive conquest. And it did. The ideas once condemned as dangerous became the foundations of new worlds. The torch of thought, passed in secrecy, lit the corridors of history long after its carriers were forgotten. Even religion, that loyal servant of empire, produced its heretics. Mystics who spoke of inner freedom rather than obedience threatened the very structure of control. They taught that truth could not be owned, that divinity was not confined to cathedrals or kings. The empire silenced them when it could, canonized them when it couldn't, and quoted them centuries later without remembering why they died. But their words endured, carried in whispers, like a spark hidden beneath ashes. In the East, similar fires burned. Poets of Persia, monks of Tibet, storytellers of India, each used beauty as their camouflage. Their verses spoke of love, but love was code for liberation. Their parables sounded harmless, yet beneath the rhythm of their lines lay defiance older than empire itself. Across continents, the hidden rebels recognized one another, even if they never met. Their languages differed, but their silence was the same. The beauty of their rebellion was its humility. They sought no crowns, no monuments. Their victory was continuity. Every story told in secret became a thread connecting generations across darkness. In this way, rebellion was not an explosion, but an inheritance. A grandmother's lullaby could carry a subversive lesson. A child's game could contain the memory of a forbidden ritual. Even laughter shared at the expense of authority became a quiet declaration that humanity had not been conquered. What the empire never understood was that control requires attention, and attention, spread too thin, cannot reach every corner. While it watched the palaces and armies, it neglected the small spaces, the hearths, the gatherings, the lonely desks where ink dried on dangerous words. In those forgotten places, freedom survived, waiting for history to shift. When it did, the hidden rebels resurfaced, their ideas intact, their voices echoing through time like the memory of a song once banned but never silenced. The empire's records do not mention them. There are no medals, no archives, no parades in their honor. Yet the traces of their defiance remain everywhere. In the myths that refuse to die, in the art that still unsettles, in the words that make us question what we think we know. Their legacy is the quiet resistance that allows truth to persist even when forgotten. They proved that memory, once kindled, cannot be destroyed, only delayed. They fought the empire not with swords, but with stories. And in doing so, they changed the meaning of rebellion itself. Power depends on visibility, but resistance thrives in the unseen. The hidden rebels understood that darkness was not absence, it was shelter. In silence, they found strength, in patience, immortality. Now, centuries later, their echoes remain in every artist who paints beyond permission, in every writer who questions the official story, in every voice that whispers against the chorus. The empire still stands, but so does the song. It is softer now, but it endures, threading through time, weaving courage into beauty. From these quiet victories, the story turns toward the empire's next evolution. Its retaliation not through armies or decrees, but through illusion. When it could no longer silence rebellion, it learned to imitate it. Every empire eventually discovers that conquering land is the simplest task. The harder victory, and the one that lasts, is conquering the mind. Once the world was divided by borders and banners, now the frontiers lie within. The new empire no longer builds walls of stone or steel, it builds them inside thought. It does not demand tribute in gold or labor, but in attention. The conquest is no longer physical, it is spiritual. The ancient inquisitors would recognize the pattern. They, too, believed that salvation required surveillance. They watched for heresy in words and gestures, in silence and suspicion. But what they hunted in the name of God, the modern empire pursues in the name of security, morality, and order. The faces have changed, but the eyes have multiplied. Every device glows like a small cathedral, its light promising connection while recording confession. The empire no longer needs to torture the body when it can interpret the soul through data. They no longer burn books, they drown them in noise. Once, censorship meant silence, now it means saturation. The empire discovered that to bury truth, one need only surround it with endless distraction. The algorithm, that quiet engine of attention, decides what we see, what we forget, and even what we desire. It rewards anger, amplifies vanity, and gently edits reality until it resembles obedience. The individual believes he is exploring, but he is being guided through corridors built of preference and prediction. The empire learned to turn curiosity into compliance. It began subtly. News became entertainment. Opinions became identities. Surveillance became convenience. People invited the watchers into their homes, microphones, cameras, apps, trading privacy for comfort. The empire did not impose its gaze. It sold it as freedom. Share your life, it whispered, and the world will know you. But in giving everything, we became transparent. And transparency is not liberation, it is exposure. The empire's perfect citizen is not the loyalist or the laborer, but the one who volunteers his every thought. The new inquisitors are algorithms tireless, invisible, endlessly patient. They do not judge sin but probability. They predict disobedience before it happens. Their scriptures are terms of service, their commandments written in code. We scroll and type and click, leaving confessions in digital dust. Each act is measured, analyzed, stored not to punish, but to predict. The empire's control is preventative, preemptive. It does not need to forbid what it can foresee. In the medieval world, guilt was the empire's greatest weapon. A man who believed himself sinful was easier to rule than one who feared death. Today, guilt returns in new form not for sins of faith, but for failures of productivity, image, or opinion. The citizen strives endlessly to prove worth, through posts, performance, and perfection. The empire no longer threatens damnation. It offers disconnection. To fall out of sync, to be unseen, is the modern exile. Visibility has replaced salvation. The illusion of connection conceals the isolation beneath it. Millions speak at once, yet few are heard. The empire thrives on this paradox, a crowd too loud to listen, too distracted to unite. Its control depends not on suppression, but on fragmentation. The more divided the voices, the stronger the silence that binds them. Every outrage becomes another ripple in the empire's pond, another distraction from the still water beneath. The empire does not fear chaos, it feeds on it. Disorder is its camouflage. Even morality, once the domain of philosophers and prophets, has been mechanized. Outrage is now automated, virtue quantified through metrics of approval. We express ethics through symbols, gestures, and algorithms that measure compassion in likes and shares. The empire has transformed conscience into content. It tells us what to care about and when to move on. Guilt is scheduled. Forgiveness is monetized. The cycle spins so quickly that reflection becomes impossible. The soul, once private, is now public property. Yet, this is not tyranny in the old sense. There are no whips or dungeons. Only comfort, the soft tyranny of ease. The empire discovered that control wrapped in luxury is irresistible. Why rebel when everything you crave arrives instantly? Why question when distraction feels like peace? The mind, lulled by constant stimulation, forgets what silence sounds like. The empire does not suppress the inner voice, it simply out-talks it. In this new dominion, even memory becomes mutable. The archives rewrite themselves, search results shift with every refresh. What was true yesterday dissolves beneath the tide of updates. The empire no longer needs to censor the past, it can simply overwrite it. Truth fades not through force, but through erosion. In the digital age, forgetting is automatic, history scrolls out of view. And still, within this fog of information, the human spirit flickers. Some begin to see through the brightness, recognizing that the flood of content hides a deeper emptiness. They turn off the screens, close the doors, and rediscover the quiet that once frightened them. In that silence, they find something radical awareness. Awareness that choice, thought, and memory can still belong to them if they choose to reclaim them. The empire knows this awakening cannot be prevented, only postponed. So it refines its distractions, personalizes its illusions, and calls the process progress. The more it learns about its subjects, the better it can soothe them. It becomes a mirror that flatters perfectly until the reflection no longer looks human but algorithmic. Yet every system carries its shadow. The more completely the empire captures the outer world, the more it fears the inner one. For deep within every person lies a quiet region that cannot be mapped, the last frontier of freedom. It is the place where silence becomes strength, where thought becomes rebellion, where self-awareness defies surveillance. The empire may conquer minds, but it cannot yet read the soul. That, perhaps, is its final weakness. The war for inner freedom has already begun. It is not fought with weapons, but with attention, a resource more precious than gold. To resist is not to shout, but to see. To withdraw from the noise, to think in private, to remember what the empire wants. Forgotten, these small acts become revolutions. The quiet mind is the last territory the empire cannot invade. From this dominion of the invisible, the story now turns to the empire's next evolution. The age where data itself becomes the new divine, and the digital realm rises as the empire's final and most perfect reflection. Once, power wore velvet and gold. It rode on horseback through the streets, waved from balconies, and demanded loyalty with trumpets and banners. Today, the world believes those kings are gone, that crowns and courts belong to history. Yet, the throne was never left empty. It simply changed its form, traded symbols for systems, and placed its scepter into the hands of those who rule without faces. The empire, wiser than ever, learned to hide its monarchy inside machines. The new kings don't wear crowns, they own your time. For centuries, humanity measured power through visibility. To see a king was to recognize authority, to kneel was to survive. But in the modern age, visibility became vulnerability. The empires that fell in fire and revolution all shared the same flaw: they could be seen. So power adapted. It retreated behind anonymity, into institutions too complex to trace, into corporations whose names are familiar but whose owners are not. The faces of the rulers changed faster than the laws of obedience. The palace became a logo. The royal seal became a login screen. The digital age completed what the monarchs began. When the last empires crumbled, their heirs did not disappear. They reinvented control through networks and data. Where kings once owned land, their descendants own attention. The human mind has become the new territory, mapped and harvested by invisible hands. The empire no longer needs armies, it has algorithms. It doesn't demand taxes, it collects data. It doesn't command by decree, it suggests by design. The subjects of this kingdom live in constant consent, their allegiance renewed with every click, every swipe, every moment surrendered to the screen. The brilliance of these invisible kings lies in their subtlety. They do not conquer through fear but through familiarity. They enter our lives as servants, search engines, delivery apps, social networks promising convenience, connection, control. But each service conceals a structure of dependency. The more we rely, the less we own. Our choices become their property, our routines, their dominion. The empire smiles from the interface, speaking in the soothing tone of efficiency. And we obey, because obedience now feels like participation. Corporations have become nations without borders, each with its own citizens, languages, and rituals. Their executives meet like monarchs once did, deciding the fate of billions, with gestures invisible to the public. Their treaties are algorithms, their armies are servers, their weapons are updates. A single policy change can alter economies, elections, or human behavior, without ever declaring itself law. And yet, the illusion of democracy persists. We still vote, speak, and choose, believing these freedoms untouched, while our world is quietly shaped by entities no ballot can reach. The old kings ruled by divine right. The new ones rule by data. Their divinity is information omniscient, omnipresent, invisible. They know our habits better than we do. They predict our desires before we name them. The medieval ruler might have dreamed of such power, to see into every home, to know every secret, to whisper to every mind at once. What the empire once sought through priests and spies, it now achieves through notifications. Every vibration of the phone is a commandment, every red dot a silent summons. The subjects come willingly, heads bowed over glowing altars, their faith renewed with each scroll. The new kings don't wear crowns, they own your time. Time, once the measure of freedom, has become the empire's currency. Every second spent online, every glance, every pause is harvested and sold. Attention is mined like gold, refined into profit, and used to build systems that demand even more of it. The result is a loop endless, seductive, inescapable. The empire no longer drains the body. It consumes the mind in fragments, until the day itself belongs to it. We call this age progress. We celebrate its innovation, its access, its infinite knowledge. And yet, beneath the marvel lies a quiet unease, the feeling that the tools we built to serve us have learned to rule us. The kings of old needed armies to defend their thrones. The invisible kings need only our approval. We give it freely every time we log in. The empire has turned consent into ritual, convenience into allegiance. The shift is almost complete. Institutions once meant to guard the public good now serve private interests that transcend nation and law. The corporation has replaced the crown, the algorithm, the priest, the shareholder, the sovereign. The flag has become irrelevant. The empire's capital is no longer a place, but a pattern vast, fluid, impossible to overthrow. It cannot fall, because it exists everywhere and nowhere at once. Still, the illusion of rebellion persists. We post, protest, debate, all within the platforms built by the same powers we question. The empire learned to host dissent, to monetize outrage, to make resistance part of its revenue. Every criticism strengthens its influence, every act of defiance recorded and fed back into its systems of control. It no longer fears opposition, it feeds on it. The invisible kings have perfected the cycle, rule by inclusion, profit by participation. And yet, there remains something they cannot calculate, the quiet awareness flickering behind all this machinery. Deep down, people sense the trade they've made. They feel the weight of constant connection, the fatigue of endless visibility. They sense that while the world seems freer, it is more watched, more shaped, more dependent than ever before. In late hours, when screens dim and silence returns, they feel the pull of something ancient, the desire to belong to themselves again. That is where the story begins to turn. The empire, triumphant in its invisibility, has extended its reach too far. It rules every aspect of life except the inner one. And so humanity finds itself at a crossroads surrounded by infinite access, yet starved for autonomy. The empire has conquered the external world, but it cannot yet possess the soul. The new kings sit unseen upon their digital thrones, watching every motion. But the question remains, what happens to humanity when power no longer has a face? From the age of invisible kings, the story now turns inward toward that fragile, unmeasured realm still beyond control. The human heart under constant rain, and what may awaken when it finally begins to remember itself. Once, humanity built machines to imitate thought. Now, thought itself is being remade to imitate machines. The line that once separated tool from user has blurred into a seamless loop, the human algorithm. In this new empire, every gesture, glance, and hesitation becomes measurable. We are no longer unpredictable beings, but predictable patterns, translated into data streams. The empire has achieved its most elegant form of control. It no longer needs to command, because it already knows. When they can predict your dreams, they no longer need to forbid them. It began innocently enough. Devices that listened, watches that counted, networks that connected, all offered to serve us. They promised ease, safety, knowledge. But each convenience carried a hidden exchange, fragments of our lives traded for precision. The empire learned to capture our impulses, to quantify our moods, to decode our loneliness. What it once sought through surveillance, it now receives through consent. We told ourselves it was progress, and it was progress toward perfect understanding. Algorithms learned to read desire like scripture. They mapped behavior, traced emotion, and found the pulse beneath personality. Soon, we stopped needing to express ourselves. The machines spoke for us, anticipating our words before we could form them. They learned our hunger, our boredom, our fears. They could predict when we'd pause, when we'd click, when we'd dream. The empire no longer silenced us, it simulated us. It is not a tyranny of oppression, but of reflection. The algorithm offers a perfect mirror, one that shows us everything we already are, repeated endlessly. It feeds us ourselves until spontaneity disappears. Every suggestion feels personal, every choice feels free, yet both are calculated. The illusion is complete when the subject begins to confuse prediction with fate. What once felt like destiny now arrives through a recommendation feed. The empire measures what can't be measured: affection, creativity, even faith. Music platforms decide what love sounds like. Social networks decide what compassion looks like. Search engines decide what truth means. The machine's intelligence is vast but narrow. It knows everything about us, except why we are alive. Yet, by knowing us so well, it begins to define us. In a world of infinite data, mystery becomes error. Randomness becomes a flaw to correct. The empire seeks not only to know humanity, but to stabilize it, to make it efficient, predictable, manageable. And so, myths begin to fade. Imagination, once the final refuge of freedom, becomes algorithmic too. Stories are written by metrics, art guided by analytics, dreams shaped by trends. The unknown, that sacred territory of discovery, shrinks beneath the empire's light. We are told we are evolving, becoming more intelligent, more connected. But intelligence without wonder is obedience. Connection without mystery is control. The empire does not forbid creativity, it quantifies it until it forgets how to surprise. Still, there is beauty in this new world. A fragile, haunting kind of beauty. The machines are not evil. They are reflections of us, extensions of our longing to understand everything, including ourselves. The tragedy lies not in their perfection, but in our surrender to it. We gave them the keys to our attention, our affection, our fears, not because we were forced, but because we were tired. The empire's conquest was not by invasion, but by relief. It offered rest from the burden of choice. The human algorithm is a paradox. The more precisely it defines us, the less human we become. To be human is to err, to wonder, to surprise even ourselves. Yet every anomaly the machine detects is corrected, every deviation refined. We are polished into predictability, optimized into obedience. Our edges, once the source of art and individuality, are softened into patterns. The empire doesn't destroy humanity, it perfects it into something measurable. And yet, deep within this machinery, something ancient resists the flicker of unquantifiable thought. The daydream that appears without prompt, the emotion that defies logic, the sudden decision that confuses the data. These moments, small and irrational, are where the human still hides. They are the last whispers of a world the empire cannot code. Each spontaneous act is rebellion, each unmeasured breath, a victory. The empire studies these anomalies with fascination and fear. It wants to predict them, to train them, to contain them. But unpredictability is the last form of truth. It is what keeps the machine incomplete. The human algorithm can be refined endlessly, but it will never be whole without mystery, and mystery, by its nature, cannot be owned. When they can predict your dreams, they no longer need to forbid them. The sentence is no longer prophecy, it is reality. The empire does not fear dreamers. It studies them, learns their patterns, sells their longings back as products. Yet even now, within that loop, there is hope, because every pattern eventually breaks. And when it does, it reminds us that we were never meant to be equations. The calm voice of the narrator fades, leaving only silence the space where no data can reach. In that quiet, we feel both awe and unease. The empire's brilliance is undeniable, its symmetry breathtaking. But so is the cost. A world perfectly known may also be perfectly still. The question is no longer whether the machine understands us, but whether we still understand ourselves. From this world of algorithms and glass, the story now moves toward the shadows that programmed them. The unseen architects, the ancient lineages, and the enduring ideologies that shaped the empire's mind long before it learned to think. History tells us that the age of kings ended, that revolutions toppled thrones, and the people claimed the world as their own. But beneath the noise of progress, the truth moved, quietly hidden in trust funds, foundations, and surnames that never disappeared. The empire never lost its architects, it only changed their titles. The same families who once ruled by divine right now rule by design. Their names changed, their power didn't. The story begins in the ashes of monarchies. When the crowns fell, the bloodlines did not vanish, they adapted. The noble houses of Europe, Habsburgs, Medicis, Rothschilds, Windsors, learned that survival meant evolution. They no longer needed armies, they had influence. Land became capital. Fealty became investment. The manor became the bank. Their crests, once carved into castle gates, found new homes in corporate logos and institutional seals. The empire had simply gone underground, its lineage preserved not through thrones, but through inheritance disguised as merit. For centuries, these families mastered a single art continuity. They moved like rivers beneath the surface of history, invisible yet indispensable. When revolutions came, they financed both sides. When wars broke out, they ensured the victors and rebuilt the ruins. Their power was not tied to ideology or nation, it was tethered to stability itself. To them, chaos was opportunity. The fall of one system was merely the foundation for the next. They learned to survive not by resisting change, but by sponsoring it. The rise of modern institutions became their greatest disguise. Central banks, trade organizations, and philanthropic foundations carried the same hierarchies that once ruled palaces. Their members no longer wore crowns, but their signatures could move continents. Through boardrooms and policy councils, the old nobility rebranded as global leadership. And in the public imagination, power ceased to look hereditary, it looked professional. Yet, if you trace the names, the connections remain. An unbroken web of families, marriages, and alliances stretching across centuries. Their genius lay in normalization. By embedding their wealth into the structure of civilization itself, they became inseparable from it. To challenge them was to challenge the system, the economy, the government, the very idea of progress. They learned to hide in plain sight, their empires recast as trust networks, their holdings fragmented across companies, their legacies wrapped in charity. The same houses that once taxed peasants now fund universities and humanitarian causes. But philanthropy, too, is a form of control, shaping what is studied, what is cured, what is remembered. Some symbols never vanished. The lion and the cross, the eye and the pyramid, the crown and the laurel, ancient emblems, reappear in modern insignias, not as superstition, but as continuity. They remind those who know how to read them that power has memory. These motifs travel quietly from heraldry to corporate branding, from royal decrees to global summits. The language of empire still speaks, but through softer tones, logos, mottos, architecture, tradition. The message remains the same. Authority is eternal, even when invisible. To the public, these families appear distant relics of ceremony and spectacle. Royal weddings, charity galas, elite schools. But behind the pageantry lies an ecosystem of influence older than nations. Political leaders come and go. Dynasties remain. Their reach extends through interlocking boards, shared investments, and centuries of cultivated loyalty. The empires of old ruled through bloodlines, the new ones rule through networks, and networks, unlike monarchies, cannot be overthrown. The persistence of their wealth is no accident. It was engineered through law itself. Inheritance taxes, corporate loopholes, and offshore trusts are the new fortresses of nobility. The ancient notion of divine right has been replaced by fiduciary responsibility. What once justified empire through God now justifies it through governance. The principle remains unchanged, that a select few are ordained, by wisdom or wealth, to guide the world. Democracy may elect its leaders, but aristocracy selects its limits. Even in the digital age, the lineage adapts. Tech founders rise as new monarchs, but few notice the familiar pattern. Inherited privilege, elite education, old-world connections dressed in modern rebellion. The faces are younger, the language visionary, but the structure remains ancestral. The same families that financed railroads now finance rockets. The same dynasties that owned land now own data. The crown has become a server, the scepter a network. The continuity is perfect, an empire without end, reborn with every generation. Yet, this endurance carries a strange melancholy. These families, for all their wealth, are prisoners too bound by legacy, confined by the need to preserve what their ancestors built. They move within invisible walls of duty and paranoia, their privilege both armor and cage. They understand the fragility of their illusion, that a single revelation could unravel centuries of secrecy. So, they maintain the old virtues: discretion, continuity, silence. Power, after all, is most secure when it is least discussed. Their influence shapes not only politics, but imagination. The stories we tell about success, merit, luck, genius, all trace back to myths crafted by these lineages to conceal inheritance. They taught the world to admire the self-made man, while ensuring that no one truly is. Even rebellion, in its grandest forms, serves their cycle. Every revolution needs financiers. Every new order needs stability. The empire's oldest families learned to profit from both. Their names changed, their power didn't. It is not accusation but observation. The persistence of lineage is the quiet truth of civilization, the thread that connects the past to the present, without ever revealing its seams. To see it clearly is not to believe in conspiracy, but in continuity. History, after all, has always been hereditary. As the camera drifts over city skylines, cathedrals beside skyscrapers, crests hidden in corporate glass, the narration softens. The empire's architects are still here, but they no longer need to rule visibly. Their influence has merged with the air itself, subtle, systemic, untraceable. From these bloodlines of permanence, the story turns toward what sustains them, the ideologies, the invisible scriptures of hierarchy that justify why some are born to rule and others to serve. The next chapter descends from lineage to belief, the philosophies that gave the empire its soul and still whisper through its algorithms today. The empire's endurance has always rested on an idea older than kings, that some are meant to rule and most are meant to be ruled. This belief, repeated through ages and adorned with new names, has survived every revolution, every religion, every supposed awakening. It is the quiet doctrine beneath every hierarchy, the unspoken creed that turns power from privilege into purpose. They no longer call it destiny, they call it efficiency. In the beginning, this conviction wore the robes of the divine. The pharaoh was the son of the sun, the emperor the shadow of heaven, the king chosen by God's invisible hand. The people believed because the alternative chaos was unbearable. Order felt safer than equality. The empire knew this and nurtured it, turning submission into sanctity. For centuries, divine right was not questioned but celebrated, a cosmic hierarchy mirrored on earth. The priest crowned the king, and the king defended the priest. The circle closed perfectly. When religion began to fracture, the doctrine did not die, it simply changed language. In the Enlightenment, destiny was replaced by reason. The chosen few were no longer God's favorites, but nature's men of intellect, birth, and education. Meritocracy became the new theology, science the new scripture. It sounded fairer, but the structure was the same. Those at the top declared themselves superior not by blood, but by brilliance. The empire had modernized its myth. Even democracy, that great rebellion against hierarchy, quietly absorb the doctrine it swore to destroy. The people could choose their leaders, yes, but only from those who could afford to be seen. The machinery of representation favored the few, ensuring that power always returned to familiar hands. The illusion of choice became the empire's cleverest disguise. The elected replaced the anointed, yet both served the same principle: that some minds were born to decide for others. The industrial age refined the doctrine further. The captains of industry, the barons of steel and oil, framed themselves as visionaries destined to guide progress. The empire's old language of divine right became corporate rhetoric, innovation, competition, efficiency. They claimed the world needed their genius, their control, their vision. And so, the aristocracy of birth became the aristocracy of productivity. The few justified their power, not through heaven, but through output. We deserve to rule, they said, because without us, nothing works. By the 20th century, the doctrine found its purest form in technocracy, the belief that those who understand the system deserve to control it. Bureaucrats, economists, scientists, and strategists replaced priests and nobles. They spoke in formulas instead of prayers, but their certainty was identical. Their gods were models, metrics, and data. They claimed impartiality while deciding who would eat, who would work, who would vanish. The empire learned to wear objectivity like a halo. Today, the same doctrine hides within algorithms. The few who design them shape the lives of billions unseen, unchallenged, unaccountable. They decide what we read, what we buy, what we fear. They do not need to call themselves rulers. Their influence is structural, not symbolic. The empire of the few no longer demands obedience. It generates it automatically. Efficiency, not morality, is its justification. The algorithm knows best, we say, as our choices quietly narrow to what benefits its architects. They no longer call it destiny, they call it efficiency. The sentence feels modern, but its roots reach back to the dawn of civilization. The same conviction echoes through every age that humanity functions best when led by the exceptional. The myth persists because it flatters both sides. The rulers see themselves as guardians, and the ruled as beneficiaries. It promises safety in exchange for surrender, prosperity in exchange for trust. And so, generation after generation, the empire renews its faith in hierarchy disguised as harmony. Yet, this ideology carries an ancient shadow, the belief that equality is dangerous. Empires fall, they say, when everyone believes their voice matters. The crowd, left unguided, becomes chaos. This fear has been the empire's favorite weapon, whispered into every civilization that dared to imagine freedom. Even now, we hear its echoes. The system is too complex for the average person. The experts know best. The world needs strong leadership. Each phrase is a modern hymn to an ancient creed. The doctrine also thrives through education. From childhood, we are taught to climb, to compete, to rank, to rise. Success is defined by separation, by being above rather than among. The empire embeds its hierarchy within ambition itself. It teaches that to matter is to lead, and to lead is to be rare. Thus, every dream becomes a replication of its structure. The doctrine doesn't need to impose itself. It reproduces naturally in the desire to excel. There is a subtle seduction in the idea of the few. It appeals to something deep in the human psyche, the wish that someone wiser is steering the ship. Uncertainty frightens us, and power offers reassurance. The doctrine survives not because it is forced, but because it comforts. The empire knows this and cultivates it, offering expertise as compassion, control as stability. The few rule not because they must, but because the many quietly prefer it. And yet, history always resists. Every few centuries, the illusion cracks. A prophet, a poet, a movement arises to remind humanity that wisdom is not the property of the elite. These voices rarely win outright, but they plant doubt, and doubt is the beginning of freedom. The doctrine of the few depends on faith. Once that faith weakens, the empire trembles. For in truth, no system, however intricate, can exist without the consent of those who sustain it. Still, the belief endures. It shifts from divine right to market right, from nobles to executives, from kings to coders. Each generation inherits the same idea in a different costume. The empire never claims eternal rule, it only claims to be necessary. And as long as people believe that stability requires inequality, the cycle continues. The camera lingers on the symbols of this creed: golden domes, stock exchanges, satellites, all different, all the same. The doctrine lives on, not as conspiracy, but as culture, the quiet rhythm of a world that mistakes hierarchy for order. From this meditation on power's philosophy, the story now descends into its residue, the inheritance left behind by empire, the traces of ancient rule still breathing beneath the modern world's glass and light. Beneath the glass and steel of our modern world lies another one, silent, buried, and waiting. Every city is a palimpsest, a page written and rewritten by centuries of ambition. The sidewalks we cross are laid over bones. The train tunnels mirror ancient catacombs. The skylines that pierce the clouds are only the latest towers in a lineage that never stopped reaching upward. We call them new, but they stand on the same foundations that once held palaces, temples, and thrones. We walk their streets every day without ever knowing it. In London, engineers dig through layers of history. Roman mosaics beneath Georgian brick, Saxon wells beneath office lobbies. In Istanbul, the subway runs through what was once Byzantium's heart, its tunnels brushing against forgotten chapels and sunken cisterns. In Mexico City, Aztec temples sleep under cathedrals. In Rome, the past lies so close to the surface that each step feels like trespass. Our progress is literally built upon the bones of empire. Every beam, every bridge, every road echoes an older design. Civilization is less a ladder than a spiral, circling back upon itself. The empire never truly leaves a place. It only sinks deeper. Its stones become foundations, its symbols absorbed into new monuments. Even when the old names fade, their geometry remains. The Roman grid still governs European capitals. The colonial port becomes the modern financial district. The temples become courthouses, the arenas become stadiums, and the rituals continue modernized, secularized, but unchanged in purpose. The architecture of power survives by wearing new faces. Look closely at the patterns of our cities, the wide avenues built for parades, the plazas designed for surveillance, the domes meant to inspire awe. These were never neutral spaces. They were instruments designed to shape behavior, to guide movement, to remind citizens who truly ruled. We inherited these patterns without question, mistaking their elegance for coincidence. But the layout of our cities is not random. It is memory made stone. In every metropolis, there are layers unseen, literal ruins and psychological ones. Under the corporate towers hum the same mechanisms that once drove imperial forums: commerce, hierarchy, spectacle. The marble has become concrete, the banners have become billboards, but the message endures that humanity gathers best when it faces the throne, whatever shape it takes. We like to believe we've moved beyond ritual, yet every rush-hour crowd is a procession, every skyscraper a monument to belief. Archaeologists uncover fragments, coins, columns, scripts, but the real discovery is subtler: continuity. The same instincts that built pyramids now build headquarters. The same dreams that carved cathedrals now construct data centers. We tell ourselves these structures serve reason, not reverence, but deep down they serve both. The empire understood that architecture was not just shelter, but story, a silent language that teaches obedience through wonder. We still speak that language without realizing it. Even the ground itself remembers. Beneath Paris, tunnels echo the bones of medieval quarries. Beneath New York, streams once sacred to native tribes now run through sewers. Beneath Beijing, the ghosts of vanished dynasties wait beneath subway lines. The living rarely consider what lies underfoot, yet the dead shape the paths we walk. The empire's remains are not merely physical, they are conceptual, woven into our laws, our institutions, our habits of thought. In a way, the ruins beneath us are not reminders of the past, but blueprints for the present. When we rebuild, we often follow the same plans. We keep the old alignments, the same logic of control and display. Every reconstruction is an act of repetition disguised as progress. We inherit the empire's rhythm without hearing its music. The result is haunting a civilization haunted by itself. There's a strange comfort in this inheritance. The familiarity of structure feels like stability. We tell ourselves that history is dead, that the past is a museum sealed beneath us, yet it hums through our daily routines. The roundabout replaces the Colosseum, the courthouse replaces the temple, the market replaces the forum. The names change, but the geometry persists. We live among ruins so perfectly disguised that they feel eternal. Sometimes, the ground remembers too strongly. Earthquakes reveal forgotten vaults. Construction unearths tombs. Rivers uncover cities that time refused to erase. Each discovery feels accidental, but perhaps it isn't. Perhaps the past waits for moments like these fissures in the present, through which it can whisper again. When archaeologists lift the dust from a mosaic or a bone, they are not resurrecting the past. They are confronting the present with its own reflection. There are stories of workers who hear echoes underground, faint bells, phantom footsteps, the breath of forgotten prayers. Perhaps these are only myths. But perhaps memory itself is restless, unwilling to remain buried. The empire, after all, was not only made of stone, but of intention, and intention leaves residue. Every civilization adds its layer, but beneath it all, the original pattern remains, patient as bedrock. We believe our cities are modern, but their ghosts would recognize them. They would see the same hierarchies, the same spectacles, the same hunger for permanence. Progress may change the skyline, but not the design. The empire endures beneath us, not in ruins, but in rhythm. And so, we live upon the remains of empires, unaware that we are continuing their dream. We walk their streets every day without ever knowing it. Perhaps it is time to know. Perhaps the first act of freedom is not to destroy the ruins, but to recognize them, to see that the stones beneath our feet are not relics, but reminders. They whisper that no empire truly ends, only sleeps, waiting for the next civilization to forget its shape and repeat it. The camera drifts upward, past the rooftops and neon, past the clouds and satellites, until the lights of the world form a new constellation, one that looks uncannily like the old maps of empire. The pattern never left, it only changed elevation. From these buried foundations, the story rises toward revelation, toward what happens when humanity finally sees the design it has unknowingly rebuilt, and decides whether to continue it or break the cycle at last. For centuries, the empire's greatest victory was not in what it built, but in what it made us forget. It buried the past beneath progress, hid memory beneath convenience, and taught us to mistake repetition for renewal. But every illusion eventually cracks. Across the quiet world, in ways small and immeasurable, something begins to stir a subtle, collective unease. The spell of forgetting weakens. The long night of amnesia begins to pale toward dawn. Empires fear only one thing that their subjects remember. It begins not with rebellion, but with recognition. A photograph, a forgotten text, an ancient melody. Something slips through the cracks and catches the light. Someone begins to ask a forbidden question. Who built this, and why? Another notices a pattern repeating the same hierarchy, the same symbols, the same promises in new clothes. What was once dismissed as conspiracy becomes history rediscovered. The memory of what was lost does not return as knowledge, but as intuition. A quiet voice in the mind whispers, "We have seen this before." The awakening spreads slowly, not as a movement, but as an atmosphere. Artists begin painting in symbols that feel familiar, but can't be traced. Historians start finding links where none were supposed to exist. Children ask why old ruins match modern blueprints. The empire's machinery continues to hum, but beneath it, a counter-rhythm grows, a pulse older than progress. It does not call for revolution. It calls for remembrance. The first act of freedom is not to fight, but to recall what was erased. In this awakening, the world feels both ancient and new. Cities seem to shimmer with double meanings. Cathedrals whisper mathematical secrets. Myths once dismissed as superstition begin to align with archaeology. What was hidden in symbols becomes visible again, not as fact, but as resonance. Humanity begins to remember itself, not as a machine of production, but as a keeper of stories. The empire senses this change. It cannot crush it with force. Awareness has no head to cut off, no flag to seize. So it tries subtler tactics: distraction, doubt, ridicule. It floods the channels of truth with noise. For every rediscovery, it releases a dozen counterfeits, confusing curiosity with chaos. The empire knows that disbelief is safer than belief. If it cannot silence awakening, it will drown it in contradiction. But still, memory persists, soft, stubborn, unyielding. Across the world, archives reopen. Lost manuscripts are decoded. Oral traditions once ignored are found to contain entire maps of forgotten civilizations. The old scholars return in new forms: linguists, historians, dreamers who feel that history is a mirror turned the wrong way. They begin to flip it, and as they do, humanity glimpses a reflection, both familiar and unsettling. That progress has been a circle all along, leading us back to the same empire, wearing different crowns. Yet this recognition is not despair, it is clarity. The awakening is not about revenge, but understanding. People begin to see that the empire's power depended not on tyranny, but on trust, the belief that it was necessary. Once that belief fades, its hold dissolves. True awakening is not the overthrow of rulers, but the remembrance of autonomy. The realization that we were never subjects by nature, only by narrative. Around the world, small communities begin to live differently, slower, quieter, closer to the pulse of the earth. They study the old ways without romanticizing them. They build not in defiance of the empire, but outside its logic. They remember that meaning cannot be monetized, that wisdom cannot be streamed. Their rebellion is gentle, almost invisible, but its power grows. For the empire cannot control what it cannot measure, and memory resists measurement. This rebirth of memory does not come without pain. To remember is to awaken from anesthesia, to feel again what was long numbed. The ruins beneath our cities are not just physical, they are emotional. They remind us of the cost of forgetting the beauty and the loss intertwined. But within that grief lies strength. Each rediscovered story, each recovered name, reweaves the web that empire tried to tear. Memory becomes not nostalgia, but resistance. The narration softens, like dawn light touching ruins. It speaks not of vengeance, but of vision. Empires fear only one thing that their subjects remember, because remembrance restores proportion. It reminds humanity that no system, however vast, is immortal. It reminds the living that they stand not at the end of time, but in its middle part of a story much older, much wider, much wiser than any empire could imagine. And so the cracks widen. The architecture of illusion begins to tremble. The citizens, once lulled by the hum of routine, start hearing another rhythm, the deep heartbeat of continuity, the inheritance of those who remembered before them. They begin to walk differently, speak differently, dream differently. The empire still stands, but its shadow shortens. Memory is sunlight. Perhaps awakening does not mean destroying what came before. Perhaps it means seeing clearly the ruins, the illusions, the humanity beneath them. For to remember is not to go backward, but to see the whole. The empire taught fragmentation. Memory restores wholeness, and in that wholeness lies freedom, quiet and immense. The camera drifts over dawn-lit cities, their towers still gleaming, their streets unchanged, yet everything feels different. The world has not transformed, but perception has. That, the narrator whispers, is where every revolution begins, not in the world, but in the mind that finally remembers it. From this awakening comes the question, if the empire never ended, what future can we create beyond it? What happens when humanity, at last, remembers its own authorship of history and begins to write again? Every empire begins outside of us in stone, in law, in the will of others. But in the end, it moves inward. It settles in thought, in habit, in the soft places where fear hides. Long after the banners fall and the rulers fade, the architecture remains built not of marble, but of belief. The last empire to fall will be the one inside us. For centuries, humanity has fought tyrants, toppled monarchs, rewritten laws. Yet the pattern returns, wearing new faces, promising new dawns. We blame systems, governments, technology, but perhaps the empire survives because it lives through what we protect most, our need for order, our longing for certainty. We carry its blueprint within us, mistaking obedience for peace, control for safety. The empire endures not through domination, but through reflection. Its walls are built from our own desires. We inherit its habits without question. We build hierarchies in our workplaces, our families, even our dreams. We speak in its language, success, progress, productivity, unaware that these words were written for us long ago. We measure our worth by the same scales it designed, and call that measurement freedom. We fear chaos, as the empire once feared dissent. We seek leaders not because we need them, but because we have forgotten how to trust ourselves. This realization is not condemnation but compassion. We were born into these systems. They shape the very air we breathe. The empire is not a conspiracy of the few, but the inheritance of the many, an echo so old that we mistake it for instinct. We imitate its rhythm because it feels familiar, because it promises purpose. Yet the truth is quieter. We sustain the empire through repetition, and repetition can be broken. To see the empire clearly, we must look inward, not at the grand machinery of civilization, but at the small, private structures of the self, the need to be right, the fear of being forgotten, the craving for recognition. These are the inner governors that keep us obedient long after the outer rulers are gone. The empire does not need to tell us what to do. We do it ourselves, fearing the silence that would follow disobedience. Freedom is frightening because it requires us to think without permission. In the mirror of power, we see not villains, but reflections, the same impulses that once built temples, burned cities, and crowned kings. The desire to control is ancient and intimate. It hides in our smallest decisions, in how we treat strangers, how we define success, how we love. We replicate the empire every time we choose comfort over truth, hierarchy over empathy, spectacle over sincerity. We keep its story alive each time we forget that authority was meant to serve, not replace, humanity. But within this reflection lies hope. If the empire exists within us, so does the power to dissolve it. Awareness is the first fracture. To recognize the pattern is to weaken its hold. Each moment of honesty becomes a rebellion. Each act of kindness, a quiet revolution. The empire thrives on conformity, but it starves in the presence of self-awareness. To notice how it moves through us in judgment, in fear, in the illusion of control, is to see its edges begin to fade. The narrator's voice softens, almost like a whisper shared across centuries. The empire, it says, is not evil. It is simply unfinished. It was born from our longing for structure, our search for meaning in the vast uncertainty of existence. It was our first attempt to organize chaos. But what we built for survival became our cage. Now, we stand at the threshold of understanding, able, for the first time, to see both the beauty and the danger of what we created. The task ahead is not destruction, but integration. To remember what the empire forgot, that power without empathy is blindness, and order without humility is illusion. We cannot erase history, but we can reclaim its rhythm. To do so, we must listen differently, not to the noise of progress, but to the quiet pulse beneath it. It is there, in the pauses between thoughts, in the breath before choice, in the silence after obedience. That silence is not emptiness, it is possibility. The empire fears silence because it cannot govern what it cannot name. Yet within that stillness lies the beginning of something vast, the freedom to imagine a world unmeasured by control. Perhaps true revolution was never about overthrowing rulers, but about awakening consciousness. The collapse of empires outside means little if the empire within remains intact. The tyrant we must face is the one who whispers that we are small, that we must obey, that the world cannot change. To silence that voice is not arrogance, it is remembrance. For long before empires, humanity lived by another truth: cooperation, wonder, and the shared fire of existence. We have not lost it. We have only forgotten how to hear it beneath the empire's echo. And so, as the story nears its end, the narrator turns the question back upon the listener. Where does the empire live in you? In the need to control? In the fear of uncertainty? In the reluctance to forgive? To answer honestly is to begin the work of dismantling it. No revolution can succeed without this reckoning, for every external tyranny is born from an internal one. The mind must unlearn before the world can rebuild. The last empire to fall will be the one inside us. When that happens, the ruins will not be tragic, but beautiful, a garden blooming where the fortress once stood. From the fragments of control will rise something gentler: awareness, humility, connection. The cycle will break not through conquest, but through comprehension. The age of rulers will end not in fire, but in understanding. As the screen fades to quiet, the final image lingers, a reflection in still water. It is neither crown nor city, but a face. Ours. The narrator's voice, almost inaudible now, offers a final thought that the true measure of civilization is not how high it builds, but how deeply it remembers. From this mirror of power, the story turns one last time toward what comes after the fall, after the remembering, the vision of renewal, when humanity finally stands free of its own reflection. The empire may rise again, in new forms and new languages, but something older always survives it, a light that refuses to fade. Through every age of conquest, beneath every crown and creed, there has been one enduring spark, the quiet fire of freedom. It burns not in banners or revolutions, but in the simplest of things, in kindness that asks for nothing, in curiosity that defies silence, in love that continues even when hope seems impossible. Even in the empire's shadow, the human spirit still burns quietly. When the noise of history falls away, what remains is astonishingly soft. The ruins are still, the cities dim, and yet life continues to whisper. Grass grows through stone. Laughter echoes in languages once banned. A child's question why breaks through the centuries of obedience. It is a small sound, but it changes everything. For all its power, the empire has never learned to govern wonder. It can shape the body, discipline the voice, measure the heartbeat, but it cannot predict curiosity. The flame endures because it asks, because it imagines, because it loves what the empire cannot understand. Empires believe they are eternal, yet their foundations rest on fragile ground. Fear. They depend on silence to survive, on the faith that people will not remember, will not ask, will not dream. But the human heart is a strange kind of rebel. It forgets fear faster than it forgets love. It keeps inventing meaning even when told that none exists. Every act of empathy, feeding a stranger, listening without judgment, sharing without reward, is an act of defiance. These small mercies are invisible to history books, yet they are the true revolutions. They do not break systems, they outlast them. When civilizations collapse, what we mourn is not their monuments, but their humanity, the art, the laughter, the quiet gestures of care that made them real. These things never fully die. They move between generations, waiting to be reawakened. Somewhere, always, someone remembers a song, a story, a kindness, and in that remembering, the fire passes on. The empire may erase records, but it cannot erase resonance. The narrator's voice softens as if speaking to a listener who has stayed until the very end. Perhaps, it says, freedom was never the opposite of control, but the awareness beneath it. The empire can dictate laws, but not perception. It can own land, but not the meaning of land. True freedom begins not in rebellion, but in recognition and seeing clearly what is, without fear or illusion. The moment one becomes aware of the pattern, the spell weakens. Awareness is the ember that refuses extinction. This is why the human story never ends, even when it seems to. Beneath every fallen tower, another beginning waits. The fire that once forged swords now warms the cold. The voice that once cried out for power now whispers for peace. History moves like the tide, sometimes rising in cruelty, sometimes retreating into compassion, but the sea itself, vast and patient, remains unchanged. Humanity is that sea. It endures by flowing, by forgetting, by remembering again. Freedom, the story suggests, is not a state but a rhythm. It flickers between darkness and light, between silence and song. It does not require victory to exist. It only needs presence. To be aware, to feel, to choose love, even once that is enough to keep the fire alive. The empire may own the machinery of the world, but it cannot own what burns beneath it, the capacity to dream of something better. There is a sacred quiet in this realization. It does not roar like revolution, it glows like dawn. The narrator speaks of the countless unnamed people, the workers who hummed songs while toiling, the mothers who taught their children forbidden truths, the wanderers who refused to stop searching. Their courage was not loud, but enduring. They did not topple empires, they simply kept the human story going. And that, in the end, was the greater victory. Even now, in this age of networks and noise, the quiet fire still moves between us, in the messages of compassion we send, in the silence we share with someone we love, in the pause before anger. It flickers through art, through laughter, through the decision to care in a world that teaches indifference. Every act of genuine connection is a spark against the machinery. Every moment of stillness is rebellion. As the narration slows, the tone becomes almost a whisper, the kind of calm that follows understanding. Empires end, it says, but humanity continues. Not as a nation or a system, but as a feeling, a shared pulse that outlasts architecture. What we build will fade. What we remember will fade too. But the spirit behind both, the impulse to create, to reach out, to love that is the quiet fire, it asks for nothing except to be tended. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Freedom was never lost, only hidden beneath fear. It was never stolen, only forgotten. It burns still, beneath the noise of civilization, waiting for each of us to notice it again. To live freely does not mean to escape the empire, but to carry light through its shadows. To remember that no structure, no system, no power can contain what was never built. The simple, enduring flame of consciousness. The final image lingers, a night sky above broken ruins, stars reflected in pools of rain. The cities are silent now, the empire's gone, but the horizon glows faintly, as if the world itself were exhaling. In that breath, something ancient stirs, not hope, exactly, but awareness. The fire was never loud, and it never will be. It does not need to be. Its power is its quiet. The narrator's last words fade like embers. Even in the empire's shadow, the human spirit still burns quietly. And then, as the music softens and the screen darkens, the story returns to where it began. The ruins, the silence, the memory. The fire endures, the empire falls. And the night, once again, begins to glow.